What we want to do is we now want to create some confidence intervals using our students' T model. Of course, to do that, last week we needed that Z star value, and the easiest way to find Z star was to use our technology. This week, because we're not using a normal model and therefore we're not using Z, this week we're going to find our critical values, which is going to be a T star value. Just like last week, when you're looking at whatever the interval is, we need to find the percentile in order to find the correct or appropriate value. So remember that if we had a 90% interval, that means 90% happened here in the middle, and that meant 5% happened here and 5% happened here. And we found that by taking whatever the leftover was from 100 and dividing it by 2. But then we needed to say, what would this value be? Well, from here, everything to the left would be this 5% and this 90%. So this would be at 95%, which we called 0.95. That's our percentile, and that's the number that we need to use to find our critical value. So again, we're looking for our T star in the exact same way we found our Z star last week. Now, of course, one way to do this is to use a T-table, which works exactly the same way a Z-table does. And so I could look for whether it's two-tailed or one-tailed, and the number of degrees of freedom is here. I'm not going to really show us this way because it can get a little bit tricky if you've got values that are sort of in between two values, and so I'm going to show you, or I'm going to focus specifically on using technology. If you are interested in the T-table, I will add it to your course, the same place that you find your notes weekly. So if I want to find a critical value for means using the TI-84, I have to remember, of course, that I'm dealing with T rather than Z. So last week we used inverse normal to find those scores. This week we're going to use inverse T. So I'm going to do second and vars, and instead of inverse normal, which is 3 like last week, this week I'm going to do inverse T. Now for inverse T, you can't just put the 0.95, because as we said, for each degree of freedom, the model is a little bit different. So here, I also need to include the degrees of freedom. So in our case here, we're going to practice using a sample size of 20. So using a sample size of 20 means my degrees of freedom is 20 minus 1, which is of course 19. So on my calculator, I'm going to enter 19, and then I'm going to paste, and I get 1.729. And that is the T star that I would use for this particular 95% or 90% confidence interval with 19 degrees of freedom. Now, if you don't have a calculator or you prefer using StatCrunch, it's just as easy as it was last week as well. We're going to go up to Stat and Calculators, and last week we went to Normal. This week we're going to T, but notice it looks very similar. And then of course I'm just going to enter my degrees of freedom and the percentile to the left, just as I did before. So here my degrees of freedom was 19. And then again, this is the box that I'm putting it into, and I'm going to put my 0.95. And again, this is for 90% confidence because there's 95% to the left. And then I'm going to compute. So again, that means 5% here, 95% here. I'm using this value, 1.729, same as I got when I used my calculator. Now, just as I did in Mod 8, where I showed you the newfangled way to do it because I didn't know how to do this before, essentially we're going to go to the same place. We're going to go to Stat, Calculators, and T. And previously we were finding 19 degrees of freedom, and a 90% interval we would actually have to put in 0.95, which was confusing for a lot of people to get the 1.729. If instead I go to between, I use my 19 degrees of freedom and I put my 90% interval here, notice it does show me my interval, it shows me the shape of my curve, and it gives me my true critical values, and of course I would be using the positive one.